They called her too weak for combat, a judgment passed in whispers across the sun-scorched gravel of forward operating base Kestrel. It was a verdict rendered not on her record, which was a ghost in the system, but on her frame. Sergeant Vance was built like a long-distance runner, all lean muscle and economic movement, a stark contrast to the thick-necked infantrymen who saw strength only in mass. They saw a liability. A support clerk mistakenly issued a rifle, and they waited for the moment she would prove them right. They did not know that the most dangerous things often come in small packages, and that a day was coming when their survival would depend on the very woman they dismissed. That day would end with her carrying two of their own, one on each shoulder, through a storm of fire and shrapnel, a living monument to their profound miscalculation. #1. Arrival. The C-130's ramp lowered with a hydraulic groan, vomiting a wave of shimmering heat and fine dust into the cabin. Alara Vance descended into the glare of the Afghan sun, her pack cinched tight, her M4 held at a low ready. Her movements were fluid, disciplined, each step placed with an unnerving precision on the cracked tarmac. Around her, soldiers grunted under the weight of their gear, their faces already slick with sweat. They were broad, loud men, their camaraderie built on shared hardship and overt physicality. They glanced at her, then glanced away, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright dismissal. FOB Kestrel was a blister on the face of the earth, a fortified compound of HESCO barriers, sandbags, and plywood hunched against a backdrop of jagged, unforgiving mountains. The air tasted of dust and diesel fumes. Vance ignored the stares. She had learned long ago that the opinions of others were a weight she did not need to carry. She moved toward the processing tent, her eyes scanning everything. She noted the placement of the perimeter guard towers, the overlapping fields of fire from the 50 calories emplacements, the slight depression in the terrain to the northwest that offered a covered approach to the wire. Her mind was a tactical map, constantly updating, assessing, cataloging. Inside the tent, a harried-looking master sergeant glanced at her transfer orders, then at her. He grunted. "Vance Alara, you're assigned to the TOC. Colonel Madsen will want to see you. Don't get lost." He pointed vaguely toward a larger, antenna-bristled structure. She nodded once, her face betraying no emotion. "Thank you, Master Sergeant." Her voice was quiet, calm, without the gravelly affectation some tried to adopt. It only seemed to reinforce the perception of her as something other than a warrior. As she walked toward the Tactical Operations Center, the whispers followed her like a shadow. "That's her? The new Intel NCO?" One soldier muttered to another. "Looks like she'd snap in a strong wind," his companion replied, not bothering to lower his voice. "But she can't even hump a full pack up to observation post Phoenix." Alara heard them. She always heard everything, but she gave no sign. Instead, her focus was on her gear. She unslung her rifle, checked the action, reseated the magazine with a practiced, near-silent click. She adjusted the straps on her body armor, feeling the familiar, reassuring pressure of the ceramic plates against her chest and back. This was her world. The feel of worn nylon, the scent of carbon and gun oil, the cold, hard geometry of a weapon. The chatter was just noise, interference on a channel she had learned to tune out. Her competence wasn't a matter for debate. It was a fact waiting for the right circumstances to be demonstrated. The men of FOB Kestrel could believe what they wanted. The enemy, she knew, would not make the same mistake. #2. Dismissal. Colonel Madsen was a man carved from granite and impatience. His office, a cramped plywood box within the TOC, smelled of stale coffee and antiseptic wipes. The walls were covered in maps marked with grease pencil, overlays showing patrol routes, suspected enemy positions, and IED strikes. He was on a secure video call when Vance entered, his voice a low growl of frustration. He waved her to a rickety chair without looking at her. Alara stood instead, her posture perfectly erect, her hands clasped loosely behind her back. She waited, Patience was a weapon, and hers had been honed to a razor's edge in crucibles he couldn't imagine. After 5 long minutes, Madsen ended the call with a curt out and swiveled his chair to face her. His eyes, chips of blue ice, swept over her from head to toe. It was not an assessment. It was a dismissal. He picked up her file, which was conspicuously thin. "Sergeant Vance," he said, his tone flat. He flipped a page. Records got more black ink than text. "Previous assignment, redacted. Special qualifications, redacted. All I know is Command sent you here to be my new intelligence liaison. Frankly, Sergeant, I don't know what the hell to make of you." He tossed the folder onto the desk. "Look, I'll be blunt. This is a kinetic environment. We are in the business of fighting, not shuffling papers. My soldiers are carrying 100-pound packs in 120-degree heat. They're kicking in doors and taking fire. You," he gestured at her with an open palm, "you look like you belong behind a desk at the Pentagon." Alara's expression remained unchanged. Her gaze was direct, meeting his without challenge but also without submission. "My appearance has no bearing on my capabilities, sir." Madsen let out a short, humorless laugh. "Doesn't it? The men out there need to trust the person analyzing their intelligence. They need to believe that person understands the world they operate in. They see you, they see a liability. Someone who can't keep up. Someone who doesn't get it. Understand, sir, do you?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "I run a tight ship. We have a high operational tempo and zero room for error. Your job is to sit in that chair." He pointed to an empty console in the main TOC, monitor intel feeds, and write reports. "You are to provide analysis to my S2 officer, and that's it. You're not to leave the wire unless I personally authorize it, which I have no intention of doing. You are a support asset, nothing more. Stay out of the way, do your job, and we'll get along just fine. Are we clear?" The condescension was a physical thing, thick and suffocating. He saw a clerk, a paper pusher sent to his war zone by some out-of-touch general. He didn't see the coiled strength in her stillness, or the formidable mind working behind her placid gray eyes. He saw a woman he judged as weak, and in doing so, he revealed his own critical blind spot. "Crystal clear, sir," Alara said. Her voice was steady, a calm island in his sea of skepticism. She gave a precise nod, turned, and walked out of his office, leaving Colonel Madsen staring after her, already certain he had taken her measure. He had not even come close. ####3. Observation. For the next 3 weeks, Alara Vance became part of the furniture in the TOC. She was a silent presence at her console, her eyes tracking the flow of information across multiple screens. Drone feeds, radio intercepts, signals intelligence, and human intelligence reports trickling in from patrols. She spoke only when necessary. Her reports delivered in a clear, concise monotone, stripped of all speculation. She was efficient, methodical, and utterly invisible. The soldiers in the TOC, and indeed across the FOB, settled into their initial assessment of her. She was Sergeant Vance, the quiet intel geek who probably got a nosebleed if she jogged too fast. They saw her in the chow hall, eating alone, her focus on her meal as if it were a tactical problem to be solved. They saw her at the gym, but not lifting heavy weights like the infantrymen. She was always in a quiet corner, engaged in a grueling routine of bodyweight exercises, yoga, and flexibility training that looked more like dance than strength conditioning. They mistook grace for fragility. But while they were watching her, she was studying them. More than that, she was studying the entire ecosystem of the base. She learned the rhythms of FOB Kestrel. She knew which generator sputtered before failing, which guard tower had the best view of the eastern pass, and which one had a blind spot obscured by a small rocky outcrop at 400 meters. She knew that Sergeant Miller's patrol took the northern route on Tuesdays and Thursdays with a predictability that bordered on suicidal. She knew that Corporal Reyes, one of the comm specialists, was brilliant with hardware but panicked when troubleshooting under pressure. She knew Specialist Chun, his partner, was slower but methodical, a calming influence on Reyes. One afternoon, she was at the small arms range, methodically zeroing her M4. It was a mandatory qualification, and most treated it as a chore. Alara treated it like a religious rite. She lay prone, controlling her breathing until her heartbeat was a slow, steady drum. She squeezed the trigger, the rifle bucking softly against her shoulder. She didn't need the spotting scope to know where the round went. She could feel it. 2 soldiers from 1st Platoon were on the lane next to her, blasting away at their targets, their shots grouped loosely around the center mass. They watched her fire a 5-round group. When she was done, one of them swaggered over. "Not bad, Sergeant," he said, his voice thick with condescension. He gestured at her target, a single ragged hole in the black, no bigger than a quarter. "Lucky group." Alara said nothing. She ejected the magazine, cleared the chamber, and laid the weapon down, safety on. She walked to her target, replaced it with a fresh one, and returned to the firing line. Without a word, she loaded a single round, shouldered the rifle, and took aim at the small, printed number 7 at the edge of the paper. She fired. Then she loaded another round and fired at the 9. Another at the 4. She cleared her weapon and stood. The curious soldier ambled downrange to look. He stopped, staring at the paper. The number 7 was obliterated. The 9 was gone. The 4 was a perfect hole. He looked back at Vance, who was already packing her gear, her expression unreadable. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty entered his eyes. It was a small thing, a tiny crack in the foundation of their certainty about her. But it was a start. She wasn't just observing the base. She was mapping its weaknesses, both in its fortifications and in its assumptions. ###4. Pressure. The crisis began, as they so often did, with a burst of static over the radio. It was mid-afternoon, the TOC humming with a low drone of servers and air conditioning units, fighting a losing battle against the oppressive heat. Colonel Madsen was overseeing plans for a major operation set for the following week. His attention focused on a large digital map. Alara was at her station, monitoring a live feed from a Reaper drone circling high above the Pesh Valley. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Reaper 1-4. We are in contact, heavy contact. Ambush, Grid 34S. The voice was young, panicked, and distorted by distance and desperation. The placid atmosphere of the TOC shattered. Madsen was on his feet instantly, barking orders. "Give me a location. What's their status? Who is in command?" The radio operator, a young private, fumbled with his controls. "Sir, the signal is breaking up. I'm getting something about multiple casualties." Another voice, calmer but strained, cut through the static. "TOC, this is Reaper 1-4 actual. We are pinned down in a narrow wadi, taking effective fire from elevated positions, east and west. We have at least 3 men down. We need a QRF and immediate CAS. Over." Madsen's face was a thundercloud. "QRF is spinning up. Vanel 2-1, you are go. I repeat, you are go. Where the hell is that air support?" He roared at the Air Force liaison officer. Chaos descended. Shouted orders, the frantic clatter of keyboards, the escalating panic in the voices coming over the speakers. The communications net was becoming a tangled mess of overlapping transmissions. The patrol was trying to report their situation, the QRF was asking for vectors, and pilots checking in were adding to the noise. Information was becoming garbled, lost in the electronic cacophony. Corporal Reyes and Specialist Chun, the comms team, were working feverishly to clean up the signal, their faces pale with stress. "Sir, there's too much interference. Something's degrading the signal. We can't get a clean channel to the patrol," Reyes said, his voice tight. Through it all, Alara Vance remained perfectly still. Her eyes were closed. She wasn't looking at the screens anymore. She was listening. She tilted her head slightly, filtering the noise, isolating frequencies, identifying patterns in the static that the others dismissed as random interference. The panic in the TOC was a distraction. The real problem was in the airwaves. She heard the faint, looping electronic pulse hidden beneath the patrol's frantic calls, a telltale sign of a sophisticated enemy jamming device. They weren't just being shot at, they were being systematically blinded and deafened. Madsen slammed a fist on the main console. "Damn it, Talk to me. What is their exact position? The radio crackled again, the voice from the patrol now weak, desperate. They're closing in. We can't. The transmission dissolved into a howl of static. The pressure in the room was immense, a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. Men trained for this were succumbing to the friction of war, their processes breaking down under the strain. Reyes was sweating profusely, swapping out modules on the comms rack with trembling hands. Madsen was pacing like a caged animal. And in her corner, Sergeant Vance slowly opened her eyes. The time for observation was over. #5. Intervention. Alara stood up. Her movement was so deliberate and quiet that at first, no one noticed. She walked past the frantic radio operators and stood behind Corporal Reyes' station. "Move," she said. It wasn't a request. Reyes, startled, looked up at her, his face a mask of confusion and stress. "Sergeant, You're trying to fix the signal at the hardware level." Alara cut him off, her voice low but carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "The problem isn't your equipment. It's theirs. Get up." Reyes hesitated, glancing at Colonel Madsen, but there was something in Vance's eyes, an absolute, diamond-hard certainty, that made him push his chair back and stand. Alara slid into the seat. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, a blur of motion. She ignored the primary interface, instead pulling up a command line terminal and typing in strings of code. The screen filled with scrolling text that was meaningless to everyone else in the room. Specialist Chun watched over her shoulder, his eyes wide. "What are you doing?" "That's the backhand diagnostic for the frequency hopping algorithm. They're using a wide-spectrum jammer," Alara said without looking up, her focus absolute. "But it's reactive, not predictive. It listens for our primary frequency and then floods it. It takes the system a few milliseconds to hop to a new, clean channel. They're exploiting that lag." Madsen had stopped pacing. He strode over, his face a storm of anger and disbelief. "Sergeant, what in God's name do you think you're doing? Get away from that console." Alara ignored him. Her fingers never stopped moving. "I'm not trying to find a clean channel. I'm creating 1-inch." She typed a final command and hit enter. "I've programmed a microburst transmission protocol. It will compress the patrol's next transmission into a single data packet and send it on a sequence of 5,000 channels in under a second. Their jammer can't react that fast. It will sound like a click of static to them, but our system will reassemble it on this end." A tense silence fell over the TOC. Everyone stared at the comms console. For a terrifying 10 seconds, there was nothing but the hiss of empty air. Madsen opened his mouth to berate her again, but before he could speak, a single, sharp blip sounded from the speakers. On Alara's screen, a waveform appeared. A progress bar flashed as the system decompressed and reassembled the data packet. A moment later, a crystal-clear voice filled the room, stripped of all static. "Have 3 wounded, 1 critical. Pinned at grid 34S-E-C-8-8-4-9-9-1-5. Enemy is concentrated on the eastern ridge. We have maybe 5 minutes before they overrun our position. How copy, TOC?" The collective exhalation in the room was a physical gust of wind. The radio operator relayed the grid coordinates to the inbound attack helicopters. Madsen stared at the console, then at Alara, his jaw slack. He had been shouting for a solution, trying to muscle his way through the problem. She had simply, quietly, and brilliantly dismantled it. Alara stood up from the chair and gestured for Reyes to return. "The channel will hold for 90 seconds before they adapt. Get all the critical information you need. Now." She turned and walked back to her own station as if nothing had happened, her face as placid as a frozen lake. She had not raised her voice. She had not boasted. She had simply identified a problem and solved it with ruthless efficiency. The intervention was over. #6. The shift. The immediate crisis passed. The air support, guided by the precise coordinates Alara had pulled from the ether, obliterated the enemy position on the ridge. The QRF reached the beleaguered patrol, evacuated the wounded, and a tragedy was narrowly averted. Within an hour, the ambient noise in the TOC had returned to its normal, steady hum. But the atmosphere had changed irrevocably. The whispers about Sergeant Vance had stopped. In their place was a stunned, curious silence. People still glanced at her, but the looks were no longer dismissive. They were questioning, reevaluating. The men and women in the TOC had just witnessed something that didn't fit their established narrative. The quiet, weak intel sergeant had sliced through the fog of war with the precision of a surgeon, her calm a stark contrast to their own barely controlled panic. Colonel Madsen stood by the main communications bank, speaking in low tones with Corporal Reyes and Specialist Shin. Reyes was gesturing animatedly at the console, explaining what Alara had done in a series of technical terms that Madsen was struggling to follow. She didn't just bypass the jammers, sir, Shin added, his voice filled with awe. She reverse-engineered its methodology in seconds, based only on the signal degradation pattern. Then she wrote a counter-protocol on the fly. I've been to advanced signal school. They teach theory like that, but I've never seen anyone actually do it, especially not under that kind of pressure. Madsen nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on Alara's back. She was at her console, writing her after-action report, her posture unchanged, her focus absolute. He had publicly and privately dismissed her. He had called her a paper pusher. He had threatened her for touching a piece of equipment she understood better than his own highly trained specialists. The sheer depth of his misjudgment was beginning to dawn on him. Who was this woman? He walked over to her station. He stood there for a moment, waiting for her to acknowledge him. She finished her sentence, then looked up, her expression neutral. Sergeant, Madsen began, his voice rougher than usual. That was effective work. It was as close to an apology as a man like him could manage in that moment. I was addressing a tactical problem, sir, she replied simply. How did you know how to do that? That's not in any standard intelligence training manual. I listen, she said, her answer as cryptic as it was simple. The patterns are always there, if you know how to listen. Madsen was a man who dealt in facts, in verifiable intelligence. He was not comfortable with mysteries, and Sergeant Vance was now the biggest mystery on his FOB. He was a commander, and he had a dangerous, unknown operating right under his nose. The shift in perception was complete. She was no longer a liability to be sidelined. She was an asset to be understood, and perhaps a weapon to be deployed. The respect she had earned was still fragile, born of shock more than understanding, but it was there, and it would soon be tested in a far more visceral and demanding arena than the clean, air-conditioned confines of the TOC. #7. The second test. The test came 3 days later, and it came with the deafening roar of an explosion. A supply convoy returning to the FOB was hit by a massive, command-detonated IED less than a kilometer from the main gate. The blast was colossal, flipping the lead MRAP, mine-resistant ambush-protected, vehicle onto its side like a child's toy and sending a plume of black smoke and pulverized earth into the sky. The QRF was scrambled instantly. This time, there was no hesitation. Madsen, standing in the center of the TOC, locked eyes with Alara. Vance, you're with me. It was a barked order, not a question. He needed every capable hand, and he was no longer blind to the one he had previously overlooked. Alara simply nodded, already moving. She grabbed her helmet and plate carrier from beside her desk, shrugging into them with an economy of motion that spoke of endless repetition. She snatched her rifle, checked it, and was at the door of the TOC before the other officers had even processed the order. The scene at the ambush site was hellish. The overturned MRAP was on fire, thick, acrid smoke pouring from its mangled hull. The air was thick with the smell of burning fuel and cordite. Small arms fire snapped and whizzed from a series of mud brick compounds overlooking the road, a classic, well-coordinated secondary attack designed to kill the first responders. The QRF established a perimeter and began returning fire, the heavy thump-thump-thump of their machine guns providing a baseline to the chaotic symphony of the firefight. Madsen directed the defense while medics rushed toward the stricken vehicle. Alara moved with the second fire team, her steps low and controlled, her eyes scanning the rooftops and windows of the compounds. She moved like a predator, her aim for seemingly an extension of her own body. "We've got 2 men trapped in the turret." A medic yelled over the din. "They're alive, but pinned by the wreckage. We can't get to them." The turret of the MRAP was crushed against the ground, leaving a space barely large enough for a person to crawl out of, and it was directly exposed to enemy fire. Specialist Chun, who had been part of the QRF, laid down suppressing fire before a round ricocheted off the wall behind him, peppering his neck and shoulder with shrapnel. He cried out and collapsed. At the same moment, a burst of machine gun fire stitched across the ground near Corporal Reyes, and he went down, clutching a leg spurting crimson. They were both exposed, trapped in the kill zone. The medics were pinned down. The firefight was too intense to risk another man. For a moment, everyone froze. It was a death sentence. Then Alara moved. She didn't shout. She didn't wait for orders. She broke from cover, sprinting across the open ground in a low crouch. The 20 yards to the wounded men felt like a mile. Bullets kicked up dust at her heels. She moved in an erratic, weaving pattern that made her an impossible target. She reached Reyes first, her hands expertly finding the wound on his thigh. She pulled his tourniquet from his kit, cinched it high and tight with brutal efficiency, stopping the arterial bleed in seconds. "Stay down," she commanded. Then she was up and moving again, a blur of motion toward Chun. His wounds were less severe but debilitating. The battle raged around them. Madsen, watching through his binoculars from a position of cover, felt his heart seize. What is she doing? She'll be cut in half. Alara reached Chun, assessed him in a glance, and then did something that defied belief. She hoisted Chin's dead weight over her right shoulder in a firefighter's carry. Then, with a grunt of raw effort that was drowned out by the gunfire, she bent down, hooked her left arm under Reyes' shoulders, and dragged him up, slinging him over her other shoulder. For a staggering, impossible moment, she stood there, a slender woman bearing the weight of 2 fully grown men in body armor and gear, a combined load of over 400 pounds. The muscles in her neck and back corded into ridges of steel. A low, guttural sound escaped her lips, a sound of pure, unadulterated will. Then she began to run. It wasn't a sprint. It was a slow, grinding, powerful drive. Each step was a monumental effort, her boots sinking into the soft dirt. She was a human fortress, shielding the 2 men with her own body. The enemy fire, which had been sporadic, seemed to focus on this single, unbelievable sight. Round snapped past her head. One struck the ceramic plate on her back with a deafening crack, staggering her. She stumbled, went to one knee, the weight threatening to crush her. Madsen's heart stopped, but then, with another guttural roar, she surged back to her feet and kept moving, step by agonizing step, back toward the safety of the perimeter. The men of the QRF, stunned into action, unleashed a hellacious volume of fire, covering her retreat. She finally crossed the line into cover and collapsed, gently lowering the 2 wounded soldiers to the ground before falling to her knees herself, head bowed, chest heaving as she dragged air into her burning lungs. #8. The reveal. The firefight ended 20 minutes later. The enemy broke contact and melted away into the hills. Back at the FOB, the medics whisked Reyes and Chun to the field hospital. Both were stable, their lives saved by the tourniquet and the impossible rescue. The story of what Sergeant Vance had done spread through the base like wildfire. It was told in hushed, awestruck tones in the chow hall, in the barracks, and in the maintenance bays. The soldiers who had once mocked her slight frame now spoke of her with a kind of reverence. They had seen something that day that their minds were still struggling to process. It wasn't just the strength, it was the sheer, indomitable will. Colonel Madsen found Alara by the armory, stripping and cleaning her rifle with meticulous, steady hands. Her movements were slightly stiff, but otherwise, she showed no sign of the superhuman effort she had exerted. Her backplate, which she had set on a bench, had a deep, spiderweb crack radiating from the point of impact. It had saved her life. Madsen stood before her, the power dynamic between them now completely inverted. He was no longer the skeptical commander. He was a subordinate in the presence of something far beyond his experience. "I've been on the comms with Bagram," he began, his voice quiet. "With Central Command. I wanted to know who they sent me." Alara continued cleaning the bolt carrier group, not looking up. "It took a general's authorization to even open your file, Vance. Most of it is still blacked out. But I saw enough. Task Force Nomad." He paused, letting the name hang in the air. Task Force Nomad was a ghost, a myth whispered about in classified circles. It was a Tier 1 Special Missions unit, so secret it didn't officially exist. They handled the missions that other Special Forces units couldn't or wouldn't. Deep infiltration, clandestine operations, high-threat hostage rescue. They were the scalpel in the dark. Your file says your specialty was solo deep penetration and personnel recovery. They sent you behind enemy lines, alone, for weeks at a time. Your physical profile, it wasn't a liability. It was a requirement. Small frame, low body weight, high endurance. You could move through terrain and blend in where a man of my size would be spotted in a second. And the strength, he shook his head in disbelief. Functional strength. The kind that comes from carrying your own body weight, plus 100 pounds of gear over mountains for days on end. It's not about bench pressing. It's about enduring. Alara finally looked up at him, her gray eyes holding his. "It's about getting the job done, sir." Madsen let out a long breath. "They called you Wraith. That was your call sign, wasn't it?" A flicker of something, a memory, a ghost of a past life, crossed her features before vanishing. "That was a long time ago. Why are you here?" Madsen asked, the question genuine. Someone with your background doesn't get assigned as an intel liaison on a sleepy FOB. "Why did they send you to me?" "Because this valley is about to stop being sleepy, Colonel," she said, her voice dropping to a confidential tone. "And when it does, you're going to need an analyst who knows exactly how the enemy thinks, moves, and fights from personal experience. You're going to need someone who can see the patterns before the ambush is sprung." She slid the bolt carrier back into the upper receiver with a smooth, metallic sigh. The rifle was whole again. The mystery was solved. She wasn't too weak for combat. Combat had been forged for people exactly like her. ####9. Respect. The next morning, Colonel Madsen called a full battalion formation on the main parade ground. The sun was already beating down, but the men stood in disciplined ranks, their curiosity palpable. It was unusual to have a full formation for anything less than a memorial service or a visit from a VIP. Sergeant Vance stood in the back rank of the headquarters element, her position dictated by protocol. She was just another soldier in the formation, indistinguishable in her uniform. Madsen took his position in front of the assembled troops, his command sergeant major at his side. He cleared his throat, and his amplified voice boomed across the gravel. "Yesterday," he began, his voice resonating with authority, "this battalion faced a coordinated and vicious attack. We sustained casualties, but thanks to the swift actions of the QRF and the courage of individuals on the ground, every single one of our soldiers came home." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the faces of the men. Courage comes in many forms. Sometimes it's loud. Sometimes it's quiet. For weeks, we have had a soldier among us whom many of you, myself included, have misjudged. We made assumptions based on appearance. We made assumptions based on silence. We were wrong, dangerously wrong. He turned and looked directly at the back rank where Alara stood. "Sergeant Vance." Alara's head snapped up. "Sir," she responded, her voice sharp and clear. Front and center. A low murmur rippled through the ranks as she stepped out and marched with crisp, precise movements to the front of the formation, halting directly before the colonel. She stood at perfect attention, her eyes fixed on the distant mountains. Madsen faced her. "Sergeant Alara Vance," he said, his voice now devoid of amplification, a personal address for all to hear. "Your actions yesterday during the ambush on the convoy were a display of valor and strength of the highest order. You saved the lives of Corporal Reyes and Specialist Chun at extreme risk to your own. You demonstrated a level of physical and mental fortitude that I have seldom witnessed in my 30 years of service. He took a step back, drew himself up to his full height, and rendered a slow, deliberate salute. It was a stunning breach of protocol. A full-bird colonel does not salute a sergeant. It is always the other way around. But this was not about rank. This was about respect. It was a public and profound acknowledgement of a warrior. For a beat, the entire battalion stood in shocked silence. Then, as one, from a newest private to the most senior command sergeant major, 1,000 hands snapped to a salute. The sound was like a single, sharp crack of thunder, a unified gesture of ultimate respect. Sergeant Vance held her composure. A single muscle twitched in her jaw. She raised her own hand and returned the colonel's salute, her movements as precise and economical as ever. Her eyes met his, and in that shared glance, an entire history of dismissal was erased and replaced by a foundation of unshakable, earned respect. ###10. Closure. Later that evening, long after the sun had bled out behind the western peaks, Alara sat on an ammo can at the edge of the FOB, looking out at the darkened landscape. The wind was cool, carrying the scent of dust and distant wood smoke. The floodlights of the base cast a sterile, protective glow behind her, but her focus was on the shadows beyond the wire, the world she knew better than anyone. She had her rifle across her lap, field-stripped on a simple cleaning mat. The ritual was calming, a meditative practice that centered her mind. The rhythmic scrape of the carbon rod, the smell of CLP solvent, the satisfying click of metal parts fitting perfectly together. It was a language she understood. She was no longer the subject of whispers or dismissive glances. When she walked through the base now, soldiers stepped aside. They met her eyes and gave her a slight, respectful nod. She hadn't changed, but their perception of her had been irrevocably altered. The label they had placed on her, too weak, had been shattered, and they had no other label to replace it with other than her name. A shadow fell over her. She looked up to see Corporal Reyes, his leg heavily bandaged, leaning on a pair of crutches. In his hand, he held out a steaming metal mug. "Coffee, Sergeant," he said, his voice quiet, filled with a gratitude that needed no further words. "Figured you could use it." Alara took the mug. The warmth seeped into her hands. "Thank you, Corporal. How's the leg?" "It'll heal. Doc said the tourniquet saved it." "Saved me?" He looked at her, his eyes trying to convey the depth of his debt. "What you did? I've never seen anything like it." She just nodded, taking a sip of the coffee. It was strong and bitter, just the way she liked it. "Rest up, Reyes. We need you back on the comms console." He nodded, understanding that she wasn't one for long, emotional displays. He simply said, "Yes, Sergeant," and crutched his way back toward the barracks, leaving her alone once more with her rifle and her thoughts. She finished cleaning the weapon, reassembling it with the innate familiarity of a master craftsman. She was not a hero. She was not a myth. She was a soldier who had done her job. The weight of their judgment, a burden she had never acknowledged but had always felt, was finally gone. She was just Sergeant Vance. And as she stared out into the vast, dangerous darkness of the Afghan night, she knew her work here was just beginning. She was exactly where she needed to be.